Hello. I hope everyone has found the cake that is in the foyer. The cake has on the top of it an artistic rendering of the cover of Ralph's book. You will not find this cake anywhere else, so you must get your piece here. Welcome back to SouthTalks, to the semester, to our campus post-Ice Storm 2026. We've actually already launched our Spring 2026 programming, but you might not remember that. It's been about 75 years ago. In fact, our organizing theme for this academic year is Reading the South, a broad umbrella under which we have considered topics as various as museum culture and folk festivals, photography and African stamps, secret diaries, and public parks. But before we get to today's subject, reading a landscape, a special thanks to all those at the center who make SouthTalks events happen. To Afton Thomas, whose vision guides this series, to Rebecca Cleary, who let you know to be here today, and to graduate students Deja Samuel and Assis Sharesta, who support our work in a variety of ways, including being sure that today's talk will shortly be accessible on our YouTube channel. And a preview. We have another South Talk tomorrow at 5:30. Emory University Professor of African American Studies Alex Chapman will be here to talk about his new book, Raising the Bottom, Bounce, Music, and Black Queer Performance in Post-Katrina New Orleans. My name is Katie McKee, and I'm the Center's director. As it turns out, one of the recurring delightful features of my job is introducing my colleague Ralph Eubanks at events. He's heard me say this before, but I believe I first met him in this room years, even decades ago, when a co-instructor, having run into him downtown at the Bottle Tree Bakery, invited him to come speak to our Southern Studies 101 class about the text we were then reading, Ralph's first memoir, Ever Is a Long Time. At that moment, Ralph was at the Library of Congress. I never dreamed that I would one day have the good fortune to work alongside him here at the center, where he currently serves as faculty fellow and writer in residence, teaching classes about civil rights history and heading up efforts to tell more fully the story of the 1970 protest on this campus, recently memorialized in a Mississippi Civil Rights Trail marker authored by Ralph. And I certainly never imagined the chance to accompany him, as I did, to the governor's mansion following his receiving the 2023 Mississippi Governor's Arts Award for Excellence in Literature. That was fun, man. And if you get invited to get any other big awards, I'm available to go with you. We've gotten into some good trouble here together at the university, and I'm delighted that we can celebrate with you today the publication of your fourth book, When It's Darkness on the Delta, How America's Richest Soil Became Its Poorest Land. In the prologue to this work, Ralph encapsulates a key approach in Southern studies, using the word palimpsest to suggest the Delta as a place where what the land means and how it and its people are seen has been erased and written over time and time again. He tells of a land filled with stories, which for some reason people feel compelled to tell me on dusty roads and sagging front porches with the wind blowing beneath my feet. But he doesn't leave it at that. He also makes the next crucial move that is fundamental to Southern studies. He opens those stories up, so that as the book moves along, readers see that at its very core, the Delta story is an American story. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ralph.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that wonderful introduction. And thank all of you for being here. Flashing back to the Governor's Arts Award, I remember we were in the Governor's Mansion, and my wife, I said, we're going to look around here some. She said, but aren't there people who live upstairs? I said, I am never going to be invited here again. We're going to look at much of this as we can see. So I want to thank you all for being here. And as Katie mentioned, I was once director of publishing at the Library of Congress. And one of the things that I learned there from editing illustrated books a lot of them in photography, is that what a photograph says, and I place says in quotes because the one thing a photograph cannot do is speak, and I say that thinking of my late colleague David Wharton, who would often remind students of that. But a photograph can be read in several ways, and in my last book, A Place Like Mississippi, I was very much concerned not just with what the photograph conveyed about the literary landscape of Mississippi, but I felt compelled at the same time to really talk about what some of the things that happened on these beautiful settings. How do you write about the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a place that was described by Delta writer Hodding Carter II as a soft, near-tropical abode of chameleon sea and white sand, and not talk about the way on that same beautiful spot a mob beat black protesters, integrating that beach with pool cues, clubs, chains, blackjacks, lead pipes, and baseball bats. As the writer and critic Jeff Dyer reminds us in his book, The Ongoing Moment, there is a peculiar alchemy between the visual and the verbal. And sometimes the alchemy of the visual and the verbal is such that the world it depicts becomes what Dyer refers to as a series of interleaved appearances. Now, as all of you know, the South is America's most documented region. And why is that? But I think that the draw for the South is that it's perceived as a place that is authentic in some ways, a place that is geographically and culturally distinct from the rest of the country, even though I would argue that today we are all living with one foot in the South. But as historian Scott Matthews notes, images of the region seem to be caught between enchanting primitivism and endemic pathology, with the two often blurred together. Now, while some places, customs and traditions in the region remain frozen in time, many have changed and evolved. And the idea of Southern place and custom also changes depending on who is behind the camera. And as many of you know, I have taught classes here looking at photography of the South. I've written about photography of the South. This is kind of a hard thing for me to do, to talk about my own photographs, because I usually don't do that. But as I explored the Mississippi Delta for my current book, I didn't go anywhere without both my camera and my notebook. Once it was just my notebook, but capturing what I saw as I was in the Delta became just as important as writing about what I was observing. Photography has become a way of seeing the landscape and the natural environment of the Delta, a place that is, I have to remind people all the time, it is a created environment of the postbellum South. Photographs have also become important to me as an aide-mémoire for my writing. As I worked on When It's Darkness on the Delta, I used photographs to document places I'd been and to help me describe them and continue to see them when I was not there. Because part of the time that I was working on this book, I'm working on this book at the Radcliffe Institute, a long way from the Delta, and I needed some way to kind of keep that with me while I was in Massachusetts. Now, originally I'd hoped that a photograph would open each chapter, but my publisher didn't have access to the right kind of paper to keep the image from doing what we would refer to in book production as having a lot of show-through. So instead, we ended up with the photo section in the book, which is right in the middle, where I tried to create a narrative that echoed the book's chronology. But I was lucky that the Oxford American was also interested in publishing a collection of photographs and a full photo essay, which allowed me more space to explain why photography was so important to this book. And the way I made a decision about the photos for the photo section and the photo essay is the photo was there to help the reader enter the world of the Delta, to really see what I had seen. But I'm assuming also that many of my readers may have never been to the Delta. But they also, although they may not have been to the Delta, they do know the mythology of the place. So in many ways, what I'm trying to do in the photography is to work against the power of myth. So the original working title of my book was When It's Darkness on the Delta, An American Reckoning. The current subtitle, How America's Richest Soil Became Its Poorest Land, came later because you have to have something that kind of works with keyword searches. It's a whole marketing thing. But I really did like that subtitle because it drove the way that I was thinking about the book. The original subtitle explains what I was seeking to do, to tell a story of personal reckoning, as well as what I think should be a national reckoning with the Delta and places of deep disadvantage that are like it. Now, most of us know the Mississippi Delta from Farm Security Administration photographs like this one by Marion Post Wolcott, which is taken in Mileston, Mississippi. And this photograph was kind of a starting point for me because I used this photograph in several books at the Library of Congress. What I didn't know until years later is that you see that building right there, there's another building right next to that, and that is where my parents lived when they married in 1951. So, and my mother told me that this is exactly what it looked like when she arrived in the Delta in 1951. So that's why I decided to open this rather than one of my photographs, this photograph, because this photograph is one of the things that kind of launched this book for me. Seeing this photograph, the photographs that Marion Post Wolcott made of Mileston, going into the FSA files, and seeing Roy Stryker's correspondence with Marion Post Wolcott about the work that she was doing there. So one of the things that I realized as I've written about the Delta, I've come to recognize that we need to change the way we see the place. And I say this in the book, I say the way we have to change the way we see the Delta is to change what we know about it. And that's why I think moving from FSA photographs to contemporary ones is so important. This next photograph is up there is from February of 2016. And it was when I started driving through the Delta just kind of aimlessly, and outside of Belzoni, Mississippi, I saw those two sharecropper shacks. And you don't see them on the landscape very much. And that is the most recent one. I've been photographing these over a 10-year period, watching kind of the way that they have gone to their decline. And so, but one of the things I realized in looking at this, the desire to represent reality, beauty, and truth at the same time remains one of the great tensions in the art of photography. And I think the looming question the Mississippi Delta has to face is, how do we alter our gaze to look toward the future in a way that embraces what is real, as well as what is aesthetically pleasing? How do we get people to see the truth rather than the myths about the place? And in choosing images that might help readers see and know the Delta in a new way, I constantly had to ask myself, what are my responsibilities as a storyteller? And what I really came to see is that to imagine a future for the Delta and change the way we see it, I came to realize that the photographs must acknowledge the past, like this one, while not allowing it to overshadow the present. Is my way of seeing the Delta the only way to see this great alluvial plain? I would argue no. But I am asking the reader to engage with my way of seeing. What I've come to understand about this process is that the photographs that open each chapter or in that photo section or in my photo essay are not there to illustrate the text. And conversely, the text is not an extended caption for the images. Images are there to evoke a place or an idea, to document what I've seen as I've traveled the Delta. Words and images must exist on equal terms in a mutually enhancing relationship. one cannot overpower the other. And that's really what I came to see with these. I'm going to go through just a few of the images that I've taken over the time that I was in the Delta, and also while the 4 months that I spent living in Clarksdale, Mississippi. As you can tell, I kind of became obsessed with the shotgun dwelling. And whenever I saw a shotgun dwelling, I took a photograph of it. This is in Baptist Town in Greenwood, Mississippi. And this next one is outside of Duncan, Mississippi. Every Sunday, I did a bike ride east and west in the Delta, and looking for things like this. And I was biking early one morning, and I saw this, and I came back later in my car because the light wasn't right to shoot it. I needed the evening light to really begin to shoot it. And so I would say there are two things that became obsessions with me: shotgun dwellings and churches. And cotton gins, because cotton gins and churches are often connected together because those are where communities once were. You see the abandoned church, you often see a cotton gin, or you see a large cotton field. So thinking about how all of those things are connected. This is outside of Vance, Mississippi. Behind that tree there was an old shotgun dwelling covered in kudzu and a cotton barn. And it kind of became a marker for me as I would drive between Tutwiler and Marks. And I just became obsessed with it. I posted this to Instagram, and my friend Maud Scott Clay said, I've been photographing that same spot for a long time as well. So this is in July of 2023, and the next one is not one of my photographs, but it actually kind of speaks to this photograph, because I received this photograph from Maudie by text message. It's on fire. So the owner of that land decided to burn the sharecropper shack and the cotton barn that was there. So what we're beginning to see, these things that once existed on the Delta landscape, whether they are shotgun dwellings, churches, are being destroyed. So what happened on that landscape is now being destroyed. When I drive down that road outside of Vance, Mississippi, I can't even tell where that tree was. And what I imagined was that tree was a place where people really went for shade when they were picking cotton out in that field, unrelieved by shade. Because what I would do is I would walk that field, and then I would come back there and sit for a while and just kind of think about what it was that I was seeing there. This is actually on Highway 6 outside of Clarksdale, a cotton gin. In the Oxford American article, it's done in black and white, but this is the full color image of it. But this is the church that is right next to it. And it's the graveyard is still being used. One of the things that I did, I would walk through the graveyard, see when was the last person who was buried there. And some of them had been buried there in the last 5 years. So even though the church wasn't part of it, people felt a connection there that they wanted their remains buried in that churchyard. So kind of exploring that part of the landscape was another thing that I was doing as I went through it. I also wrote a great deal about access to food and thinking about food deserts, and I was actually in Ruleville, Mississippi, trying to find the statue for Fannie Lou Hamer, which I thought actually would have been in downtown Ruleville, but found that it's actually on the black side of town, not in the center of Ruleville. But I shot this abandoned Piggly Wiggly for 2 reasons. My first job was at Piggly Wiggly. I was a sacker at Miller's Piggly Wiggly. And the other thing is that I also kind of thought about, this must have been a place where Fannie Lou Hamer shot. And I wanted to kind of capture that. But in writing about food deserts, I wanted an abandoned grocery store in the middle of a town to kind of depict that. I also spent time teaching writing at Parchman. And one of the things that's contraband at Parchment are cameras. So this photograph was probably taken illegally. But if you look at it, you'll see by me. And no, I'm gonna own this. I'm not gonna try to. But if you notice, there's a little smudge right there. That is because there's a nick in the windscreen of the car that I was taking the photograph through. I was afraid to get out of the car to shoot because I had seen a truck go by, and I didn't want them to see me with the camera. So I just did it through the windscreen. And I didn't notice it for a long time until I sent the photograph to the Oxford American and said, "Do you have a photo without that kind of smudge in it?" And I said, "No, I don't, because I shot it inside the car." But this is the one that really does kind of, we could not go into the cemetery, although I had been into the cemetery before. And I will tell you, the cemetery is just a sea of white crosses with no names on it. It is kind of the most ghostly place I have ever been in my life. I really did want to photograph that, but we could never go back there after teaching a writing class when that gate was open. I went through there once and the gate was open. I guess it was about 4 years ago, and I actually saw the cemetery. So it was never open while I was there. But this next one tells you a bit more about Parchment. So this is just outside the observation tower at Parchment's Unit 29. And this is where people go to serve imprisonment for life. I also learned from now Jackson Mayor John Horn that James Baldwin visited Unit 29 when he was here in the 1970s. And John Horn actually took him to Unit 29. They flew in on a private plane into Parchment. And he told me that story the day before I took this photograph. And the sign reads, "Brethren, I could not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forth unto those things which are before." This is kind of the strange syntax of the King James Bible. Now, the verse reappears all across the grounds of Parchment. So not just at Unit 29, you see the sign everywhere. And I began to look at this do some research on this, and I discovered that these are words from the Apostle Paul, and who's looking forward to the day when he will see the face of Christ, rather than looking back at his failures. Paul is forgetting everything that was behind him, including the stoning of St. Stephen the martyr, who cried out at his stoning, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." This seems like an odd and fatalistic choice to place outside a facility where men are serving in prison for life. Paul gets to do a victory lap, and these men never will. Until they die inside this perpetual congregation built from concrete and barbed wire, their sins will always be held against. And here are just a few more outside of Parchment. I was actually kind of interested in the natural delta as well. On the left is the road to Providence Farm, which is, there's an entire chapter on Providence Farm, which was an experiment that a group of Christian socialists had. Originally it was the Delta Cooperative Farm, it was in Bolivar County, and then it was moved to Holmes County in the 1930s. And one of the people who was a supporter of this was the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. And I did a great deal of research on Providence Farm in the archives at Mississippi State. I've read about where all the buildings were, the correspondence that led to them being, summarily said they had to leave Holmes County. And it was described by Harding Carter II in The Nation as a bloodless lynching. That they were given time to leave, and one of the people who actually negotiated the terms of their departure was Will Campbell. And Will Campbell asked them, "Why did you think you could come here?" And these are people who've been working with the Subintendent Farmers Union in Arkansas, had been dispossessed from the land, and they come to Mississippi and say, "Well, we thought Mississippi was safer than Arkansas." And really, this place is a place that probably led to my family leaving the Mississippi Delta in 1956. The tension that was there after the Emmett Till trial and Providence Farm. So I went out to where Providence Farm was, and I went to find the remains of it. I found nothing. All I found along that way was 2 armadillos, and those are the only things that I encountered along the way. And it's as if that place never existed. It's kind of like a sharecropper shack. It's not, that whole system, it has been erased. Providence Farm has been erased. There is a green historic marker outside that tells the stories that it ended under quote-unquote civil rights tensions, and that's all it says. And I felt because of the limited way that story was told in the historic marker, that a much fuller story that needed to be told. The other story on the picture on the right is from the Yazoo Nature Preserve, which is a much more fun story. One of the things I did while I was living in the Delta is I went to a picnic in Glen Allen, Mississippi. I was trying to find ways to connect with as many people as I could who lived in the Delta, and there's an annual picnic there for people who no longer live there, people who worked on a plantation there, and their descendants, and they've all left, but they come back for an annual picnic. And one of the people that I met at that picnic was a man by the name of Ollie Morganfield, who is the nephew of Muddy Waters. And he worked for many years developing the Yazoo Nature Preserve and trying to bring that nature preserve back to the state that the Delta was before the land was cleared. And he took me through there and told me about how he saw this landscape before the clearing of the Delta. And it was really one of the most moving experiences that I had. And he's in a chapter, there's the last slide kind of connects with Ollie Morganfield's story as well, because Ollie Morganfield and the man that I'll mention at the end were people that are in that same chapter. This next picture is a house that's outside of Rolling Fork, Mississippi. I was in Rolling Fork looking at the damage after the tornado, and I saw this house that's built on top of an Indian mound. And I hope it's haunted. But it really spoke to me about the way that there's this vast amount of wealth in the Delta, yet just 3 miles down the road, there was destruction and poverty. And I learned that what the people did on that Widow's Walk of that house is they would look out on the land that they owned and the people out there picking the cotton. And it just, so I went and took the photograph and then later on did research on the house itself. This is Samstown, which is now closed in Tunica, Mississippi. I really kind of began the book in Holmes County, where my family began, and my father came to Holmes County to Milestone in 1949. Tunica, a place that I went with my dad once, this is on the old Abbey and Leatherman plantation. If any of you know what the Abbey and Leatherman plantation is, that's a place where Robert Johnson lived as a boy. And now that plantation land is leased to casinos. So the people who are benefiting the most from casino gambling are not the people who work in the casinos, it's the landowners. Because not only do they get the leases from that, as you can tell, they still raise crops on that land as well. And I was trying to document that. And the reason I chose Samstown, first, I like the sign, but second of all, I know that there was another tower to this that had been torn down because they realized they were not meeting capacity for the casino, and now it is completely closed. Now, this image has a long story that I'm going to try to make short. And this is the reason I actually took this photograph and was here is because of my colleague Matt O'Neill, who I believe is here. Matt, are you here? Yes. So this is taken in Martin County, Kentucky, and this is at the Fletcher House, which is the house where Lyndon Johnson went to declare war on poverty in 1964. And I went to the Historical Society in Martin County to find where the house was. This would have been like the 50th anniversary, maybe the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of the War on Poverty. I found the house and I went there to take a photograph of it. I'd seen photographs of it before. I knew what it looked like, but before I took the photograph, I went to talk with the owner of the house, who was probably my age, who was probably one of the Fletcher children that I've seen photographed on that porch. I said, I'm sorry, I'm here. I know every 10 years someone comes here to photograph your house. And he says, you are allowed to photograph your house, but you can only shoot it from one side. And that's why it's at this angle. I really wanted to get a full on shot, but I was not allowed to do that. And he said, basically he said, you've got 10 minutes. So I did what the man told me to do. I had not yet seen the film Stranger with the Camera, which documents someone actually being shot for doing something similar to what I was doing, which was probably a good thing because I wasn't afraid while I was doing this. But it's just that I said, whatever this man tells me to do, I will do. But I began to, as I interviewed people in Martin County about poverty there, which has the same poverty demographics as Sunflower County, except the racial demographics are flipped. And I showed people that I was interviewing this photograph. And the silence that I got from Mr. Fletcher, I got from people there as well. None of the people that I interviewed thought that I should ever use or show this photograph to anyone. And they felt that Appalachia was more than one house, which it is. Yet what I came to recognize is that none of the people who were demanding this were poor themselves. And what I conclude is that social status really influences how people see where they live and what they want others to see. Instead, we block out those people who live below the poverty line, and some of them for generations like the Fletcher. By not showing poverty, we make it invisible. And that was one of the things that I recognized, is that these were really very good people who I would say, think about this the same way that I do, but there's some shame associated with this. So in eastern Kentucky, just like the Mississippi Delta, I experience this wealth of the culture, the pride people feel for the land they're from, and how they love the music that sprang from that land as well. And both Appalachia and the Delta have a long legacy of social activism, which continues today, but traveling to Appalachia not only let me see the connections to the Delta, but also taught me that there is this complex interaction between social action and social embarrassment. It's a common experience of humanity, yet we diminish the lives of people who live below the poverty line if we don't allow them to be seen. A photograph is not the whole story, but we can't even talk about the story of poverty in places like eastern Kentucky and the Mississippi Delta unless we see evidence of it. This is just some random images that I took. I also became obsessed with the bios in the Delta. And as I said, churches. This is one that just kind of reminded me of a William Christenberry painting. And it had the same color palette. And it's just right across from the Shack Up Inn in Clarksdale, Mississippi. But this is the last image that I wanted to talk to you about that's connected to the earlier one. Some of you may know the student Yasmin Ware, who's in the Honors College. I interviewed her grandfather, who was a sharecropper on the Stansel plantation in Ruleville, Mississippi. And he told me the story of working the fields. He told me how much his father made the year he was born. The Stansel plantation is now a solar farm. There's no longer any cotton planted there. I just happened to be walking along the square. Someone stopped me, said that we had a mutual friend, and we were talking. He says, "What have you been up to today?" I said, "Well, I just interviewed this fascinating man, John Ware, who once worked on the Stansel plantation." And he said, "My wife's family owns the Stansel plantation." And he said, "I actually have the plantation record books." So that's the plantation record book there. And looking through the interview that I'd done with Mr. Ware, the amount that he said that his father earned the year he was born is right there. It's exactly what he told me it was. So his father really did tell him exactly what it was, and the story got handed down orally in exactly the same way, which is very rare, as most of you know who do oral history. Now, the past and the present exist within the frame of a photograph, as well as the photographer's vision. Henri Cartier-Bresson was a great believer in what he called the decisive moment. He was a street photographer, unlike me. I really do photograph landscapes. I'm really not a very good photographer of people. But Cartier-Bresson defined the decisive moment as the exact instance when a unique event is captured by the photographer, when something that may never happen again is frozen in the frame. As I photographed the Delta, I can't say I was thinking about a decisive moment as such, as much as I was about how image really connected with narrative. I recognize that photography can create mythology, but instead I was seeking to use the photograph to deconstruct myths about a place of layered stories. As someone who thinks in photographs and images, and I actually do kind of think in photographs, photographs really helped me knit together a narrative for this book in ways that I don't think I could have had I not begun to take a camera with me everywhere. And I hope that for you, all of you who read the book, that the photographs also enhance the narrative. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to take questions from all of you if you have questions. Questions?